Officer John Bennington sat in his patrol car, cruising through the quiet, wealthy neighborhood he had been assigned to for years. The streets were lined with large, well-kept homes, each standing proudly behind manicured lawns and high hedges. To an outsider, it was a peaceful area, but John knew better. He had been on the force long enough to know that trouble could lurk anywhere. As he drove, John couldn't help but feel the weight of his years of service. He had seen every kind of crime, every type of criminal. Over time, his experiences had made him cynical. He often found himself making quick judgments based on appearances. It was a habit he justified as necessary for survival in his line of work. Tonight, his eyes caught sight of a sleek, black Mercedes cruising down the road. It stood out, not just because of its make and model, but because he hadn't seen it around before. John's instincts kicked in. He followed the car, his mind buzzing with questions. Who was driving? What were they doing here? His hand hovered over his radio, but he decided to wait and observe a little longer. The car turned onto a side street, and John followed, keeping a safe distance. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He had patrolled these streets enough to know most of the residents and their cars, and this one didn't fit. His suspicion grew with every turn the car made, and he decided it was time to intervene. Pamela Daniels was on her way home after a long day at work. As the CEO of a tech startup, her days were often hectic, filled with meetings, decisions, and constant movement. Tonight, she was looking forward to getting home, relaxing, and unwinding with a good book. She loved her car, a recent purchase she had worked hard to afford. It was a symbol of her success and perseverance. As she drove, she noticed a police car in her rearview mirror. It had been behind her for several blocks, and she started to feel uneasy. Her heartbeat quickened when the flashing red and blue lights suddenly appeared. Pamela sighed, pulling over to the side of the road. She took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Officer Bennington approached her car, his hand resting on his holster. Pamela rolled down her window and looked up at him. "Good evening, officer," she said politely. "License and registration, please," John demanded, his tone firm. Pamela nodded and reached for her documents, handing them over. As she did, she couldn't help but wonder why she had been stopped. She had been driving carefully, obeying all traffic laws. The tension between them was palpable, as if an invisible line had been drawn. John took the documents and stepped back to his car. He glanced over her license and registration, noting her name and address. Everything seemed in order, but he couldn't shake his suspicions. He walked back to her car, his expression stern. "Where are you coming from tonight, Ms. Daniels?" he asked, his voice filled with doubt. "From work," Pamela replied, keeping her tone even. "I'm heading home now." John raised an eyebrow. "What kind of work do you do?" "I'm the CEO of a tech company," Pamela answered, her patience starting to wear thin. She could feel the unfairness of the situation pressing down on her, but she kept her composure. John scrutinized her, looking for any sign of deceit. His mind raced, filled with biased assumptions. He couldn't understand how someone like her could afford such a car. He decided to call for backup, feeling that he needed support to handle the situation. Pamela watched as John spoke into his radio, calling for additional units. Her frustration grew. She knew she was being profiled, but she also knew that any protest could make things worse. She gripped the steering wheel, trying to stay calm as the situation escalated. Within minutes, 2 more patrol cars arrived. She took out her phone and began recording, capturing everything on camera. The officers stepped out, surveying the scene with cautious eyes. John briefed them on the situation, but his colleagues could sense his suspicions were based on nothing more than bias. Still, they proceeded with caution, not wanting to undermine him in front of the suspect. Pamela felt a wave of humiliation wash over her as neighbors peeked out from their windows, drawn by the flashing lights and the presence of multiple police cars. She sat quietly, her frustration mounting. She had done nothing wrong, yet she was being treated like a criminal. The backup officers approached John. "Do you really think this is necessary?" he asked quietly. "Her documents check out, and she doesn't seem to be a threat." John hesitated, feeling the weight of his decision. He glanced at Pamela, who met his gaze with a steady, unflinching look. Doubt began to creep into his mind, but he wasn't ready to let go of his suspicions just yet. He gestured for the officers to wait while he ran her information through the system again. John returned to his patrol car and entered Pamela's information into the database once more. As he reviewed the results, he found nothing that justified his actions. Her records were clean, and her story checked out. A sense of guilt began to gnaw at him. He had overreacted, driven by his own biases and assumptions. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his mistake. His colleagues were right. There was no reason to delay her any longer. He stepped out of his car, his demeanor more subdued than before. He walked back to Pamela's car, his heart heavy with the realization of what he had done. "Daniels," he said, his voice softer, "I've reviewed your information, and everything checks out. I apologize for the inconvenience and for the way I treated you." Pamela didn't stop recording. "I can't accept your apology," she said firmly. "This has happened to me before." John was surprised by her response. He felt bad about what had happened. "I understand," he said quietly. Pamela Daniels, however, remained steadfast, her eyes fixed on him with unwavering resolve. "This isn't just an inconvenience," she retorted firmly. "This is racial profiling, and it's unacceptable." John tried to brush off her accusation with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Ma'am, I assure you, I was just following protocol," he insisted, his voice tinged with defensiveness. Pamela's expression hardened. "This is not an isolated incident," she continued, her tone cutting through the night air like a knife. "It's a pattern that needs to be addressed." She reached for her phone and held it up pointedly. "I recorded everything," Pamela declared, her voice steady. "I have all the evidence I need. I will be filing a report." John's heart sank as the reality of Pamela's words sank in. He had been caught in a moment of bias, and now the consequences were unfolding rapidly. The next day, Pamela's video spread like wildfire across social media. It captured the entire interaction, from the initial traffic stop to John's hesitant apology. News outlets picked up the story, amplifying Pamela's accusations and sparking widespread outrage. The police department found itself thrust into the spotlight, forced to address the growing public outcry. Captain Ramirez called John into his office, his expression grave. "John, you're suspended pending an investigation," he announced solemnly. "We cannot ignore the seriousness of these allegations." John nodded silently, feeling the weight of his actions bearing down on him. He had failed in his duty as a police officer, and now he had to face the consequences. Outside the precinct, protesters gathered with signs demanding justice for Pamela and accountability within the police force. The air was thick with tension as voices rose in unity against racial profiling and systemic injustice. Meanwhile, Pamela Daniels emerged as a local hero. Her courage in speaking out against racial profiling resonated deeply within the community. She used her newfound platform to advocate for systemic change, calling for better training, accountability measures, and an end to discriminatory practices. "People need to know the truth," Pamela declared in interviews with journalists eager to share her story. She spoke passionately about her experience, and urged others to speak up against injustice. The momentum of Pamela's advocacy sparked a movement. Others came forward with their own stories of discrimination and profiling, sharing their pain and frustration. The community rallied behind Pamela's cause, pushing for policy reforms and institutional changes. In response to the public outcry, the police department announced initiatives to improve officer training on cultural sensitivity and implicit bias. They vowed to review protocols for traffic stops and interactions with the public, emphasizing the importance of fair and respectful policing practices. John underwent mandatory training sessions focused on recognizing and addressing implicit biases. He immersed himself in learning about the experiences of people of color in his community, seeking to understand and confront systemic challenges, and hopes to be a better person. What do you think about this video? Leave a comment below this video. Thanks for watching.